Bloodhound Lil Jeff was a rapping serial killer, and the warning signs were there the whole time. Every single one of them. They were in the music, they were in the way he moved on social media, they were in the life choices he made from the age of 16 all the way up until he was 21 years old and took 19 bullets to the chest on a Chicago sidewalk on June 8th, 2024. The warning signs were in the open, broadcast to anyone willing to actually look at what they were seeing, and nobody, not the platforms, not the music industry circling him, not the community around him, did a damn thing about it until it was too late. Now, when I say warning signs, I'm not talking about your typical street life gone wrong story. I'm not talking about a kid who got caught up in something he couldn't escape. I'm not talking about someone who had bad luck and ran out of time. What I'm talking about is a specific, documented, step-by-step psychological collapse, a pattern of behavior that, when you examine it through the lens of forensic psychology and criminology, maps almost perfectly onto what researchers call the radicalization pipeline for extreme violence in young men. A boy started out with hoop dreams and a mother who loved him on 79th Street on Chicago's South Side. He ended up calling himself the Jeffrey Dahmer of Chicago drill, self-styled as the Bloody Reaper, and allegedly claiming responsibility in his music with lyrics he put on Spotify and YouTube for the entire world to stream for 11 murders, 11 in 3 years, between the ages of 18 and 21. And the crazy part, the Chicago police confirmed the connection. Let me say that again because I need you to feel the weight of that before we go any further. Law enforcement in Chicago, a city that has processed more youth gun violence than almost anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, a city where detectives are not quick to make connections or throw out numbers lightly, confirmed that Bloodhound Lil Jeff was connected to 11 homicides. This was not internet speculation. This was not Reddit doing what Reddit does. This was not rival gang members talking reckless on social media. Law enforcement confirmed 11 bodies, and in that same window, Jeff was releasing music, building a genuine fan base, being credited with reviving the Chicago drill sound, and getting on tracks with established artists. His song, Ah Ah, named explicitly after the sounds his alleged victims made when he shot them, became one of the biggest underground drill records of early 2024. He got a G Herbo remix. He was in conversations about a deal with Lil Bibby's Grade A label. The music industry was opening its arms. All of that was happening at the same time as everything the streets was saying he was doing. Here's what makes this story different from every other Chicago drill documentary you've seen. This is not a story about a kid who fell into violence because there was no alternative and he had nowhere else to go. Though that environment is real and it matters, and we're going to get into it deeply. What this is, at its core, is a story about a specific psychological architecture, a specific set of traumas, triggers, identity formations, environmental conditions, and feedback loops that turned a teenager who was trying to play high school basketball into something that behavioral scientists and criminologists would describe without hesitation as a serial killer. And the terrifying thing, the part that should shake you, is that this architecture did not form in secret, it formed in public. It formed on social media, in lyrics on streaming platforms, in the way he talked about himself in interviews, in the way the streets understood what he was doing in real time. This was visible, the dots were connectable, and they were never connected while he was still breathing. We are going to connect those dots today. We are going to go through this methodically and with the respect that both the complexity of this story and the lives involved deserve. We're going to start with where Jeff came from, the specific block, the specific neighborhood, the specific environmental conditions of 79th Street in Chicago's Grand Crossing area that shaped his earliest years and established the psychological baseline he was working from before any of the street stuff even started. Then we're going to look at what the psychological and sociological research actually says, not YouTube speculation, actual peer-reviewed research about the pathways from childhood poverty and chronic community violence exposure to extreme violent behavior in young men. Then we're going to apply that research to Jeff's specific story beat by beat, year by year, from the basketball tryout that went wrong to the music career that ran parallel to an alleged body count to the Trap City slide that ended everything. And throughout every section of this video, I want you to hold one question in your mind. At what point could someone have intervened? At what point was the warning sign visible enough, clear enough, loud enough, explicit enough that a different actor in the story could have made a different choice that might have altered what happened? That question matters because it's not about Jeff anymore. Jeff is gone. The question matters because there are kids in Chicago right now, and in Memphis, and in Baltimore, and in LA, and in every city with a zip code that matches what 79th Street was dealing with. There are kids in that same psychological architecture right now, making the same moves, hitting the same trigger points, heading toward the same destination. Understanding what happened to Jeff is how we see it in someone else before it's too late. Let's get into it. For real, Jeffrey Lamar Harris Jr. was born July 14, 2002, on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. To the people who came up with him, he was Jeff. To the drill internet, he was Bloodhound Lil Jeff, or Bloodhound Lil Jeff, or the Bloody Reaper. He also called himself Jeffrey Dahmer, a deliberate respelling of Jeffrey Dahmer's name, and marketed himself explicitly as the Jeffrey Dahmer of Chicago drill. He wore that comparison everywhere. It was in his music, it was in his social media bio, it came up in conversations about him consistently. In that detail, a 20-year-old kid consciously and deliberately modeling his public identity on one of America's most infamous serial killers and treating it as a brand differentiator is not a throwaway detail. It is one of the most important warning signs in this entire story, and we are going to come back to it with the psychological analysis it deserves. But before any of the psychology, we need to establish the environment, because in a story like this, environment is not just context. Environment is causation. You cannot understand the individual psychology without first understanding the neighborhood that shaped it. Jeff grew up around 17th in Maryland, in an area that sits at the intersection of Chicago's Grand Crossing and South Shore communities. This is not a peripheral detail. This is the foundation. Grand Crossing has consistently ranked as one of the highest crime neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, which is itself one of the cities with the highest rates of gun violence in the United States. Researchers at the University of Chicago's crime lab have spent decades mapping the relationship between concentrated disadvantage, the simultaneous presence of high poverty rates, high unemployment, school failure, disinvestment, and gang activity in the same geographic space, and violence outcomes for young people growing up inside those conditions. What the research shows is not ambiguous. In neighborhoods like Grand Crossing, the firearm homicide rate for young black males between 15 and 24 is not elevated relative to the national average in any way that the word elevated adequately captures. It is 18 to 24 times higher than the rate for their non-Hispanic white peers nationally. That is the environment Jeff grew up in. That number is not background noise. That number is the air he breathed, the reality that his nervous system was calibrated to from childhood. You grow up in a neighborhood with those numbers, and your brain learns things specific, survival relevant things about threat assessment, about who to trust, about what the future looks like and how far away it is. That shaped the psychological architecture of everything that comes after. Jeff's mother raised him and his brother in that environment. By accounts from people who knew the family, she was doing what mothers in those conditions do, trying to hold things together, trying to provide a stable home inside an unstable neighborhood, trying to give her son something to hold on to. Jeff in his early teenage years had something to hold on to. He had basketball. He had the beginnings of a music interest. He was, by the accounts that exist, a kid who was genuinely trying to find a path that wasn't the street life. That matters. That is not a throwaway detail either. Jeff Harris was not born wanting to be what he allegedly became. He was shaped into it by a sequence of events that, looking back, reads like a case study in exactly how their shaping happens. Now let me set the larger landscape of the Bloodhound gang, because that's the specific environment Jeff eventually entered, and understanding it is critical. Bloodhound is a Chicago gang operating out of 79th Street, affiliated with the Gangster Disciples. GDs are one of the oldest and largest gang structures in Chicago's history, with roots going back to the late 1960s, emerging out of the same era of neighborhood destabilization, deindustrialization, and urban abandonment that produced gang culture across America's major cities. By the time Jeff came up in the late 2010s and early 2020s, however, the GD structure that older historians would recognize had been significantly fragmented. Federal law enforcement pressure throughout the 1990s and 2000s had incarcerated much of the established leadership, or replaced the old hierarchical, relatively organized structure where OGs imposed some degree of discipline and there were understood rules of engagement with something much more volatile. Sociologist Robert Asfone, in his research on Southside Chicago gang transformation, documents how the fragmentation of traditional gang hierarchies produced what he calls atomized gang sets. smaller, flatter, leaderless factions where there's no longer any meaningful internal governance, where social media has replaced organizational structure as the primary communication and reputation building platform, and where violence is consequently more frequent, more unpredictable, and more driven by interpersonal conflict and social media beef than by strategic criminal organization. Bloodhound, in the early 2020s when Jeff was coming up, fit this description. They were gaining momentum both in the streets and in the music scene. They were part of a new wave of Chicago drill that was pulling the genre back toward its most raw, most unfiltered, most street authentic version. The energy of early Chief Keef and King Von, without the major label production gloss, Jeff was the face of that. This is the world Jeff Harris Jr. was born into and eventually fully committed to. Now let's trace exactly how that commitment happened and what it looked like psychologically at every stage. Let's go back to the beginning of the part of the story that led to everything else. The year is approximately 2016-2017. Jeff is a young teenager on 79th Street. He loves basketball. This is not a casually reported detail. Multiple sources that have documented Jeff's story confirm that basketball was a genuine passion, something he invested himself in, something that represented for him the possibility of a future that looked different from the block he was growing up on. Basketball, for young men in Jeff's situation, serves a specific psychological function that goes beyond sports. It provides what developmental psychologists call a pro-social identity, an identity grounded in something legitimate, something that generates status and belonging through a pathway that society recognizes and endorses. When you're on a team, you have structure, you have accountability, you have adult figures who are invested in your performance and your development. You have peers who share a common goal that isn't gang activity. Sports psychology research on at-risk youth consistently documents that athletic participation functions as a significant protective factor against gang involvement, not because basketball is magic, but because it occupies the same psychological space that gang membership occupies. It provides belonging, identity, status, and purpose. While you have it, you have a reason to stay on the other side of the line. Jeff had that protection, and at approximately 16 years old, he tried out for his school's basketball team and didn't make it. I want to sit with that for a moment because on the surface it sounds unremarkable. Kids don't make teams all the time. It happens every year at every school in the country. But the significance of that event in Jeff's specific context, the specific age, the specific environment, the specific absence of any other structured protective factor waiting on the other side of that rejection, cannot be overstated. What happened when Jeff didn't make that team is what happens psychologically when a primary protective factor is removed without replacement. A vacuum opens up and the environment rushes to fill it. Psychologists who study gang radicalization describe the loss of a legitimate status pathway during adolescence as one of the highest risk transition moments in a young man's development. The research, including studies conducted specifically in Chicago's high violence neighborhoods, consistently shows that young men who experience significant identity disruption during this developmental window in the presence of gang-involved peer networks and in the absence of sufficient compensating protective factors show dramatically elevated rates of gang joining and violent behavior in the months following the disruption. Jeff's basketball failure hit during exactly this window. He was 16 years old. His social world was embedded in 79th Street. The Bloodhound set was right there. But here is something about Jeff's story that often gets lost in the drama of what he eventually allegedly became. He did not jump in immediately. There is documentation suggesting that Jeff spent approximately 2 more years navigating his environment without full street commitment. He got to 18 without going deep. He was doing music as a teenager, recording freestyles on his phone, developing his creative voice before the criminal narrative took over the lyrics. That matters psychologically. That is evidence that Jeff, to whatever degree the conditions of 79th Street allowed, was exercising real agency. He was trying to find something other than the street life for 2 years after his basketball exit ramp closed. He just didn't find it because no one put anything in front of him. The fact that Jeff made it to 18 before fully committing is actually evidence of resilience that never gets acknowledged. It is evidence of a kid who, in conditions that swallowed peers earlier and more completely, held out for longer than most people would have in the same situation. The environment did not have an alternative ready for him. There was no intervention that stepped into the gap when the basketball dream died. There was no mentor who showed up. There was no program that competed credibly with what the Bloodhound set was offering: belonging, identity, status, purpose, protection, and brotherhood. Those are not trivial things. Those are the core needs of any human being in adolescence. The street offered them. The legitimate world did not. So at around 18 in approximately 2020, Jeff, formerly affiliated with Bloodhound, he started getting mentioned in street circles. He started rapping. His first official song, Bloody Family, dropped in 2022 when he was 20. He followed it with I Love My Draco, featuring his frequent collaborator Rel Vert. He was building something. The music was raw and authentic in the way that the Chicago drill internet recognized and rewarded. Early tracks like BH4L, 9 with a 9, and Striker showed a genuine talent for the genre. The fast delivery, the specific storytelling, the ability to make you feel the weight and the urgency of his environment through a phone recording in a way that couldn't be faked. People were paying attention. But here's where it gets crazy, and this is the specific event that functions as the narrative and psychological hinge point of this entire story. March 16th, 2023. Jeff's cousin, known as Z-Money, a Bloodhound member, was killed. The killing was carried out by a member of the rival Trap City crew, known as Lil Cap. When Z-Money died, something happened in Jeff that, looked at through the lens of grief psychology and trauma research, follows a pattern that clinicians have documented consistently in young men embedded in violent environments. That pattern is this: in communities where grief cannot be expressed in its raw, vulnerable form, because vulnerability is coded as weakness and punished accordingly, grief gets transformed. It gets metabolized into something else, something harder, something that the environment recognizes and rewards. In the gang subculture of Chicago's South Side, the socially scripted transformation of grief is retaliation. And what the research shows, what street ethnographers and trauma psychologists have documented in interviews with active Chicago gang members, is that retaliation in this context is not experienced primarily as cold-blooded calculation. It is experienced as love. It is experienced as loyalty. It is the only available language for loss in an environment where the conventional language of grief, tears, vulnerability, seeking comfort, processing through community is not safe. Jeff jumped off the porch. That's the phrase people use. Before Z-Money's murder, Jeff was Bloodhound affiliated but reportedly still semi-peripheral in terms of actual violence. After Z-Money's murder, by the accounts of people who documented his trajectory, he was fully committed. He was all in. The grief had been transformed into something else entirely. And here's where the psychological picture gets genuinely disturbing, because what allegedly happened over the next roughly 14 months, from March 2023 to June 2024, was not one act of retaliation followed by a return to normal life. It was a sustained pattern, a pattern that, according to law enforcement documentation and street reporting, involved 11 alleged homicides, some of them allegedly retaliatory, connected to specific incidents in the Bloodhound Trap City conflict, some of them allegedly contract killings in other states, including reported incidents in Milwaukee. The full scope of what was allegedly happening was not a singular grief response. It was something that had taken on its own momentum, its own internal logic, its own psychological compulsion. But Jeff did not go quiet about any of this. That is the detail that sets his story apart from almost any comparable figure in Chicago drill history. He rapped about specific victims. He described specific methods. He named specific incidents. He called himself Jeffrey Dahmer and leaned into the comparison with apparent relish. He released music that functioned, to anyone paying close enough attention, as a real-time documentary of alleged homicide. And the most explosive example of that was released February 16th, 2024. The backstory to begins a few weeks earlier. Two individuals affiliated with the BKN Jungle Crew, Monty and Lil Rob, had robbed Jeff for his jewelry. They took his chain, then clowned him publicly on Instagram. In the ecosystem of Chicago street life and drill music, this kind of public humiliation carries enormous weight. Your chain is your status symbol. Getting robbed for it is a direct attack on your reputation. Getting clowned about it on Instagram, where everyone in the scene can see it, compounds the public humiliation into something that demands a response if you want to maintain your standing in the environment. On January 26, 2024, according to documentation that has emerged from street reports and Jeff's own lyrics, Jeff allegedly located Monty and Lil Rob with inside information reportedly provided by Bloodhound affiliate Lil Scoon, 89, and carried out a double homicide. Both individuals were shot and killed. Monty was 15 years old. Lil Rob was also a teenager. These were high school kids. They were rivals in the drill ecosystem. They had done something provocative. They had real beef with Jeff and Bloodhound. And they were also children. 3 weeks later, Jeff released Ah. The song is named after the sounds his alleged victims made when they were shot. The lyrics describe buying 2 hats from the Lid store as a metaphor for the true killings. Just walked in Lids for 2 hats, really stepping on blood. The lyrics describe a victim screaming ah when hit. They describe the precision of the approach, the inability of the targets to run. This song was not vague. This song was not the kind of music where you could claim the artist was speaking metaphorically or telling a fictionalized story. This was a specific song about a specific incident, describing specific victims, released 3 weeks after those specific victims died. And it went viral, and G Herbo remixed it, and it became one of the most streamed underground drill rappers in Chicago that year. The response from the music world to Ah Ah was almost entirely celebratory. People talked about Jeff's delivery, his flow, his storytelling. They talked about how he was reviving the energy that Chicago drill had been missing. The comment sections were full of love. The platforms kept the song up. The streaming numbers kept climbing. And not a single person with institutional power in that ecosystem publicly said, this song is describing real murders, and amplifying it as entertainment requires us to think carefully about what we are doing. I want to spend real time on this because it is the section that most other tellings of Jeff's story skip past entirely. And it is the section that matters most if you actually care about understanding what was happening in Jeff's psychology. Not just what he was doing, but why, and what the music's role in the why actually was. When Jeff made music that documented alleged violence, the music was not separate from the behavior. It was not a creative distance that he maintained between his art life and his street life. The music was performing a specific set of psychological functions that were directly feeding back into the behavior in a closed loop. Function 1, identity consolidation. Every time Jeff recorded a track that described violence, that track reinforced to him which version of himself was real, which version of himself was valued, and which version of himself the world was responding to. He had multiple potential identities available to him. The basketball kid, the creative kid, the funny and charismatic person that people who knew him personally describe when they talk about him. The music made one of those identities massive and made the others invisible. And the bigger the music got, the more impossible it became psychologically to be anything other than the Bloody Reaper. Function 2, moral disengagement. This is a specific psychological concept developed by researcher Albert Bandura that describes the cognitive mechanisms people use to reframe violent or harmful acts as consistent with their self-concept. When you name yourself after Jeffrey Dahmer and build an entire artistic identity around a serial killer comparison, and the internet gives you positive feedback for it, you are not just making a marketing decision. You are restructuring your internal moral framework. You are progressively detaching from a conventional understanding that taking another person's life is a moral atrocity, and replacing it with an internal framework in which violence is power. Power is identity, and identity is everything. The music was building the moral disengagement framework in public, piece by piece, release by release. Function 3, public accountability trap. This one is subtle but critical. Once Jeff had publicly claimed responsibility in his music, on social media, in his street reputation for multiple alleged homicides, he had created a public record that was impossible to back away from without catastrophic loss of face. In the ecosystem he was embedded in, backing away from that record, softening the identity, or showing any form of retreat from the Bloody Reaper persona would have been understood as either weakness or dishonesty, both of which carry severe consequences in a social environment where reputation is protection. The music, by making his alleged body count a public identity, had effectively locked Jeff into a trajectory he could not exit without losing everything that the trajectory had built. He was trapped by the identity he had constructed, and the music was the mechanism of the trap. This is what researchers who study social media and gang violence call the platform lock-in effect. When social media, and in drill music, YouTube and streaming platforms function as social media, provides positive reinforcement for increasingly extreme behavior. It creates a dynamic where the path of least resistance is always further, always more extreme, always more committed to the identity that the platform is rewarding. Jeff was getting that positive reinforcement constantly. Every stream was a reinforcement. Every cosign from an established artist was a reinforcement. Every viral clip was a reinforcement. The internet told Jeff over and over and over that the most extreme version of himself was the version that had a future. And Jeff, with a PTSD-driven nervous system, a fatalistic present orientation, and no meaningful competing narrative available to him, had no psychological leverage to resist that feedback. The Jeffrey Dahmer of Chicago drill branding deserves its own analysis because it is so psychologically revealing. Jeffrey Dahmer, the real one, was a serial killer who murdered 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He is one of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. Choosing him as a self-competitor and as the anchor of your artist's identity is not a standard drill flex. Standard drill flexes reference power, wealth, loyalty, and street credibility. Choosing Dahmer specifically, choosing a serial killer whose crimes were marked not just by killing, but by an almost pathological deliberateness, by a methodical quality, by a claimed lack of remorse, represents a specific psychological statement. It is saying, I kill people and I feel nothing. I am beyond conventional moral frameworks. I am operating at a level of violence that has no equivalent in normal human experience. Whether Jeff actually felt nothing, whether he was performing the callousness the identity required, or whether the constant performance of callousness had progressively eroded his capacity for moral response, that is a question no one can answer from the outside with certainty. What is answerable is this: the public construction of that identity was a warning sign. It was a sign that a young man was building a self-concept around extreme violence in a way that was progressively closing off every other psychological option. And the internet rewarded it. Let me take you to the actual science, because this is a documentary analysis and it deserves the research backing that makes it useful rather than just compelling. The first and most foundational framework is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Research, known as ACEs. The ACEs study, originally conducted in the 1990s through a landmark collaboration between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, established a relationship between childhood trauma and adult health outcomes, including violent behavior, with a level of statistical rigor that has been replicated many times over. The core finding is that adverse childhood experiences, poverty, community violence exposure, family instability, loss of attachment figures, abuse, neglect are not just emotionally painful, they are neurologically formative. They literally change the developing brain. Jeff's environment, from every available account, registered on multiple ACEs dimensions simultaneously. Growing up on 79th Street in Grand Crossing is itself an ACE. Every time a child hears gunfire from their bedroom, witnesses a shooting on their way to school, loses a friend or family member to gun violence, attends the funeral of a peer, the child's nervous system is being calibrated in ways that research shows have lasting neurological consequences. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes sensitized. The stress response system runs hot. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and consequence evaluation, develops differently under chronic stress conditions than it does in stable, low-threat environments. This is not deterministic. Children who grow up with ACEs do not inevitably become violent. The majority of children who grow up in high ACE environments do not commit serious violence. Resilience is real, and it is distributed across the population in ways that are not fully predictable. But what ACEs research does establish beyond reasonable scientific debate is that the probability architecture is different. The likelihood of specific outcomes, including violent behavior, gang involvement, and early death, is dramatically elevated for young people who grow up with multiple compounding ACEs in the absence of sufficient protective factors. Jeff grew up with multiple compounding ACEs. His protective factors, basketball, his mother's stability, his own creative instincts, were insufficient to counterbalance the environmental load. That is not Jeff's failure. That is a system's failure. The second framework is what psychologists call traumatic masculinity in gang context. Research on gang-involved youth in Chicago, conducted by Crane's Chicago Business Editorial Team in partnership with clinical psychologists, produced a framework that deserves direct quotation in its essence. By the time a young man in a Chicago gang context picks up a gun and pulls the trigger, he has been prepared to do so by deficient parenting conditions, school failure, and repeated trauma, the latter resulting from witnessing violence in the home and in the street. The PTSD that results from this chronic exposure does not look in gang-involved young men like PTSD looks in clinical depictions. It looks like hypervigilance, hair-trigger reactivity, impulsive aggression, and an inability to access the cognitive pause that would allow consequence evaluation before action. When provoked, the research framing goes, an impulsive young man has no cooling off period to consider his options before picking up his gun. The neural architecture of the traumatized brain under perceived threat bypasses the prefrontal cortex and activates the amygdala in a survival response that prioritizes immediate action over long-term consequence evaluation. For a kid whose threat detection system has been calibrated by years of actual threat exposure, that switch has a much lower activation threshold than it does for young people who grew up in lower threat environments. The third framework is present orientation, or what some researchers call fatalistic time horizons. This is one of the most important and least discussed psychological dynamics in stories like Jeff's. Research with gang-involved young men in Chicago has consistently documented a subjective experience of genuinely not believing in a future, not as dramatic posturing, not as a lyrical flex, but as a functional psychological reality. Many young men growing up in environments like Jeff's simply do not experience tomorrow as a real thing to plan for, because the statistical reality of their environment genuinely does not make tomorrow a safe assumption. When your peers are dying at the rate they are dying in Grand Crossing, when the oldest men you know who stayed on the block are in their late 20s or early 30s, and most of them are either dead or incarcerated, the internal time horizon collapses. You live in the present tense. You make decisions in the present tense. Why restrain yourself? Why defer? Why not take the shot? When your brain has no credible tomorrow to protect, today is every calculation you have. Jeff's self-comparison to Jeffrey Dahmer, his extreme public identity, his alleged escalation pattern, all of it is more comprehensible when you run it through the lens of a young man operating on a collapsed time horizon. He was not playing a long game. He was not calculating consequences across years. He was operating in an environment that had taught him, through lived experience, that the long game was not available. The fourth and final framework I want to apply is what Forrest Stewart in his sociological study Ballad of the Bullet calls the platform violence feedback loop. Stewart's research, conducted through sustained fieldwork with Chicago drill rappers and their communities, documents how the social media ecosystem of drill music has functionally erased the line between performing violence for the camera and actually committing it. The music platform requires authentic street credibility to generate the engagement numbers that drive revenue and reputation. Authentic street credibility in the drill ecosystem increasingly means documented real violence. Real violence, when documented in music, generates the engagement that drives the reputation that demands more violence to maintain. The loop is closed and self-reinforcing in social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement without regard for the human consequences of the content being amplified, accelerated at a pace that the communities experiencing it cannot match with any counter-narrative. Jeff was caught in that loop at maximum velocity. He was talented enough for his music to generate real traction. The real traction made the violent identity credible and valuable. The credible and valuable violent identity demanded continued violence to maintain. The violence demanded new music to document and broadcast it, and on until June 8, 2024. Let me break down the specific warning signs, the specific moments where a different actor making a different choice could have intervened. I want to be concrete about this because the system failed is too vague to be useful. Specific systems failed in specific ways at specific moments. Warning sign 1, the identity rupture at 16. When Jeff didn't make the basketball team, the protective factor that was keeping him on the right side of the line was removed. The warning sign was visible to anyone paying attention to that specific young man in that specific environment. What was needed at that moment was an alternative pathway, a coach who maintained a relationship and redirected his energy, a community organization with programming that could fill the identity gap, literally any adult who said the team didn't work out. But your worth is not determined by that outcome, and here's something else you can build yourself around. The basketball program failed to provide any follow-up. The school environment apparently had nothing comparable to redirect his energy. The community had no infrastructure for that specific transition moment. The warning sign went unaddressed. Warning sign 2, the gang affiliation at 18. When Jeff formally affiliated with Bloodhound at 18, that was not a secret in the community. People on 79th Street knew. The neighborhood knew. Jeff's own family was aware. In Chicago, violence interruption organizations, groups like Red Eye Chicago, Ceasefire Illinois, and similar programs have documented interventions at exactly this stage. New affiliates, young men who have just jumped in but haven't yet committed irreversible acts. The research on these programs shows that they work best when they reach participants in these early stages of deep involvement before the trajectory has fully solidified. The intervention window was open. No credible intervention reached Jeff. The warning sign went unaddressed. Warning sign 3, Z Money's murder. This was the detonator moment, and it was publicly known. Z Money's death was a community event. Everyone in Bloodhound's orbit knew. Everyone on 79th Street knew. Jeff's grief was visible. The psychological research on grief-driven radicalization in gang-involved communities is clear. The weeks immediately following a violent loss are the highest risk window for escalating involvement in young men who are already gang-affiliated. This was the last clear moment. Arguably the last moment with any realistic probability of changing what came next, when someone with the right relationship to Jeff and the right resources could have reached him with an alternative framework for what loyalty and love and grief could look like. That someone did not reach him, the warning sign went unaddressed. Warning sign 4, the music as public confession. When Jeff released I in February 2024, he released a song that everyone who was paying attention, street people, internet documenters, music journalists, law enforcement, understood was describing a specific double homicide that had occurred 3 weeks earlier. This was not a case where the connection between art and reality was ambiguous. The song was named after the sounds the alleged victims made. The lyrics described specific details. The timing was 3 weeks, and the song went onto Spotify, onto YouTube, onto every platform with commercial distribution, and was consumed and celebrated without meaningful institutional interrogation of what it was actually documented. What does it mean that a song that's explicitly connected to real homicide events was available for commercial streaming without meaningful platform intervention? What does it mean that the music industry figures who were circling Jeff for deals were not apparently engaging with what his music was documenting? What is the responsibility of a streaming platform when the content it is monetizing is, by any reasonable interpretation, a documented confession of homicide? These are questions that the music industry has not adequately answered, not just in Jeff's case, but in a broader conversation about drill music and platform responsibility. The warning sign was visible to everyone who had ears. It went institutionally unaddressed. Warning sign 5. The serial killer identity. The Jeffrey Dahmer of Chicago drill branding was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was not the kind of thing where reasonable people could disagree about what it meant. A 20-year-old kid was publicly building his entire artistic and personal identity around a comparison to one of America's most notorious serial killers, and treating that comparison as a positive, as a power statement, as a brand differentiator. The psychological literature on identity formation and violence is clear that when a young person's self-concept becomes deeply merged with a violent archetype to this degree, the prospects for behavioral de-escalation without external intervention are extremely poor. Every person in Jeff's orbit, every music collaborator, every manager, every labor representative, every social media follower who co-signed the persona had an opportunity to say something different, to offer a counter narrative to suggest that this identity was not inevitable, not the only option, not the best version of what Jeff could be. No one with influence did. The warning sign went unaddressed. Warning sign 6, the escalating public conflict with Trap City. The Bloodhound Trap City war was not a private matter by the time June 2024 rolled around. Both sides were posting about it. Both sides were releasing music about it. The specific individuals involved were named. The geography of the conflict was known. Multiple people on both sides had already been killed or seriously wounded. Jeff was the most prominent face of Bloodhound, the most publicly vocal, the most aggressively identified. That made him the most prominent target on the Bloodhound side in Trap City's calculations. By June 2024, the intelligence that Jeff was a primary target for a specific rival gang in an active escalating conflict was not hidden from anyone who was paying attention to the Chicago street scene. The warning sign was written in the music, in the social media posts, in the street reports, and on June 8th, they concluded exactly the way that kind of escalating, unaddressed conflict concludes. At approximately 5:14 in the afternoon on Saturday, June 8, 2024, Bloodhound Lil Jeff and members of his crew entered the Woodlawn neighborhood, Trap City territory. They were on the 6600 block of South Rhodes Avenue. What happened in the following minutes was captured on surveillance footage that subsequently circulated online. Jeff, wearing all black, spotted a target and chased him up the stairs and into a home. The people inside the home were ready. They were armed. According to the documentation of the shooting, Jeff was struck by 19 bullets. 16 of those bullets hit his chest. He collapsed below a first-floor window. He was now responsive on the sidewalk. First responders transported him to the University of Chicago Medical Center. He was pronounced dead. He was 21 years old and 9 months. Born July 14, 2002, died June 8, 2024. The man who shot Jeff, referred to in street circles as Trap City Rob, was subsequently taken into custody not for Jeff's murder but on a charge of being a felon in possession of a firearm. With Rob in jail on that charge, Bloodhound was reportedly unable to carry out immediate retaliation. The cycle for once paused, not because anyone chose peace, but because the mechanism for continuing it was temporarily incapacitated. The surveillance footage of Jeff's death circulated online within hours. It was on X, formerly Twitter. It was on Telegram. It was on Instagram until it was removed. It was discussed, analyzed, frame by frame, examined by internet communities that have built a cottage industry around exactly this kind of content. Community advocates who work in Chicago's violence interruption space have noted the particular cruelty of this dimension of the story. A young man's final moments of life, his most vulnerable and undignified and human moment, was converted into content within hours and consumed as entertainment by people who had never heard his name before his death footage hit their timeline. That is a trauma cycle. It is a trauma cycle that extends to his family, who must live with the knowledge that those moments are permanently archived and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. After Jeff's death, his management released a posthumous album, Stepping in Blood, on June 26, 2024, 18 days after he died. The album included the G Herbo remix of Ah. It charted in drill circles. In the months following his death, most of the artists affiliated with his crew were signed to Lil Bibby's Grade A label. The deal he had been approaching in life arrived posthumously for the people around him. The music industry did what the music industry does. It memorialized the tragedy and monetized the catalog. Jeff's story became content. His alleged murders became lyrics with remix features. His death footage became a reference point in online discourse about Chicago drill. His life became a YouTube documentary subject. His close friend Lil Scoom89 released Blood and Blood Out as a tribute with a music video featuring footage of Jeff and Scoom in their sessions in their everyday moments. The funny, human, alive version of Jeff that the Bloody Reaper persona had largely obscured while he was living it. That video is genuinely moving in the context of everything else, because it shows you the Jeff that the identity consumed. The person, the friend, the young man who was in his real daily life, apparently funny and warm and genuine and easy to love, and who had been progressively swallowed by an identity that the environment built and the internet amplified until there was nothing left. The legacy of Bloodhound Lil Jeff is genuinely irreducibly contradictory. He was a talented artist. The raw delivery, the specific storytelling ability, the way he could convey the weight and urgency of his environment through unpolished recordings, that was real. He and his crew were genuinely credited with reviving an energy in Chicago drill that had gone stale. That matters, and it does not disappear because of the context surrounding it. He was also, by every available account, including law enforcement confirmation and his own documented lyrics, one of the most prolific alleged killers in the history of the Chicago drill scene. He allegedly killed teenagers. Monty was 15 years old. These were children with their own mothers, their own stories, their own unaddressed traumas, their own warning signs that also went unaddressed. The families of Jeff's alleged victims are grieving too. They are not footnotes in the Bloodhound story. They are the full moral weight of what this story is actually about. What I want to leave you with is this. The story of Bloodhound Lil Jeff is not ultimately a story about one individual. It is a story about what happens when every system that is supposed to catch a young person in crisis fails at the same time. The basketball program has no follow-up plan for kids who don't make the cut. The school provides no alternative after the athletic identity collapses. The community has no grief intervention infrastructure when Z-Money dies. The music industry prioritizes the energy without interrogating what the energy is documenting. The streaming platforms monetize the content without asking what the content is describing. The algorithm amplifies the most extreme version of the identity because extreme generates engagement. Every system failed. And right now in Chicago and in Memphis and in Baltimore, and in every city with a version of 79th Street, there are kids who are in the exact psychological position Jeff was in when the basketball team cut him. There are kids who just lost a cousin. There are kids who are posting music where the lyrics are starting to describe real violence, and the comment section is celebrating it, and the identity is consolidating and the loop is closing. They can be reached. The research on violence interruption is clear that they can be reached at multiple points along the trajectory with the right relationships and the right resources. But you have to be looking for the warning signs. You have to understand the psychology well enough to recognize the moment while there is still time. Bloodhound Lil Jeff gave everyone around him more than enough warning signs. The tragedy is not that they were hidden. The tragedy is that we looked right at them and called them content. Rest in peace to Jeffrey Lamar Harris Jr. Rest in peace to everyone taken by this cycle. May the next generation find a different way. Let me go deeper on something I touched on earlier, because I think it is critically under-discussed in the broader conversation about what happened to Jeff and what it means for the next generation of kids in his position. The music industry, labels, streaming platforms, YouTube, the podcast ecosystem, the content creation economy around drill music, is not a passive actor in the Bloodhound Lil Jeff story. It is an active participant with agency, with decision-making power, and with economic incentives that ran directly contrary to the well-being of the young man that was in the process of celebrating and monetizing. Here is what we know happened in the months before Jeff's death. Ah was released February 16, 2024. By the spring of that year, it had accumulated millions of streams. G Herbo, a certified Grammy-nominated major platform Chicago rapper, recorded and released a remix. That remix legitimized the original in an entirely new tier of the market. It told a new audience, this is commercially viable. It told Jeff, the industry sees you. When G Herbo remixes your record, you are no longer underground. You are crossing over. And the song that was crossing over was explicitly named after the sounds of murder victims and documented with specificity a double homicide involving teenagers. No one in that chain made a public statement about the content of the song. No one said, we love the energy of this artist, but we need to be clear-eyed about what this record is documenting. No label executive who was in discussions with Jeff or his team apparently raised the question of what the lyrical content meant legally, ethically, or in terms of the artist's safety. The industry appetite was for the sound, for the authenticity, for the engagement numbers, and asking questions about what was producing that authenticity was not part of the calculation. This is not unique to Jeff's case. It is a systemic pattern that scholars of drill music and hip-hop culture have been documenting for years. The music industry has long operated on the principle that authenticity, street credibility, the sense that an artist is rapping about real life rather than fiction, drives commercial value in the rap market. That principle is not inherently wrong. Authentic storytelling is valuable, but there's a specific and dangerous application of that principle in the drill ecosystem, where authenticity has become code for provably engaged in real violence, and where the commercial system rewards that provability without any consideration of the human consequences. When an artist's lyrical content is publicly understood to be documenting real violence, when the street knows, when the internet knows, when law enforcement knows, and the commercial response is to amplify rather than to interrogate, the industry is making a choice. It is choosing to treat human beings as raw material for content production. It is choosing the engagement number over the question of whether the person producing the engagement is safe, is getting support, is being given any alternative framing for what their life and their talent could look like outside of the trajectory they are on. Jeff was 21 years old with real talent and a real audience that was growing. He was at a point in his career where the right infrastructure, not just a deal, but mentorship, protection, psychological support, a genuine long-term investment in him as a person, could theoretically have competed with the identity the streets had built. Whether that intervention would have worked, whether Jeff was too far into the trajectory by the spring of 2024 to have accepted any alternative, is unknowable. But the intervention was never offered in any meaningful form. The industry came for the sound. It was not interested in the person making the sound. This pattern has consequences that extend far beyond Jeff. When young drill artists watch what happened to Jeff, when they see that the way to get a G Herbo remix is to make a song named after your murder victims, when they see that the most extreme content generates the most industry attention, the message being sent is not subtle. The incentive structure of the music industry is teaching the next generation of Jeff level artists exactly what to produce. And the next generation is watching. I want to take you back to the early years, because there is something I haven't adequately addressed yet, and it matters for the complete picture. Jeff grew up with his mother and his brother on 79th Street. By everything that has been reported, his mother was a stabilizing presence in an environment that was anything but stable. She was doing the work that mothers in those conditions do, providing love, providing structure, providing whatever consistency she could in a neighborhood that was fighting against her on every front. The fact that Jeff made it to 18 without being fully street committed is in significant part a testament to whatever she was providing in that home. But one mother, even the most committed, most present, most loving mother, cannot substitute for the full ecosystem of support that child development research shows children need to navigate high adversity environments successfully. Teachers who know how to work with trauma-affected kids, mentors who provide alternative models of masculinity that don't center violence, community organizations with programming that can hold a young person's attention and energy, faith communities that offer belonging and structure, mental health support, actual clinical support for kids who are experiencing the kind of chronic trauma exposure that Jeff was experiencing from childhood. These are not luxuries. These are documented necessities for healthy development in high adversity environments. And in communities like Grand Crossing on Chicago's South Side, these resources have been systematically underfunded, underdelivered, and undervalued for decades. Chicago has made significant investments in violence interruption over the years. Programs like Red Eye Chicago, which provides transitional jobs, cognitive behavioral therapy, and mentorship to high-risk individuals in Chicago's most violent neighborhoods, have published rigorous data showing that targeted intervention with the highest-risk individuals dramatically reduces their likelihood of becoming involved in shootings as perpetrators or victims. Ceasefire Illinois, which deploys violence interrupters, credible messengers who have themselves lived through gang involvement, has shown measurable reductions in shootings in the neighborhoods where they operate intensively. But these programs are perpetually underfunded relative to the scale of the need, and they cannot be everywhere. They work best when they have pre-existing relationships with the community, when they are already embedded enough that they know who the highest risk individuals are before a crisis moment rather than after. In Jeff's case, whether his family knew about these resources, whether any violence interrupter had a relationship with them, whether any trauma-informed service provider had contact with them at any of the critical transition moments in his trajectory, is not something the public record can answer with certainty. What the public record can answer is that whatever systems were in place were insufficient to alter his path. The schools Jeff attended also represent a systemic failure point that deserves more attention than it typically gets in these stories. Chicago schools in high-violence neighborhoods have been chronically under-resourced for trauma-informed instruction, which is the specific pedagogical approach shown to be effective for students who are growing up with the ACE load that students in neighborhoods like Grand Crossing are carrying. When a child who has been chronically exposed to community violence comes into a classroom, they are not experiencing the classroom the same way a low AS student experiences it. Their nervous system is on a different baseline. Their stress response is calibrated differently. They may be hypervigilant, may struggle with attention and impulse control, may have difficulty trusting adult figures in authority positions. All of that is not bad behavior. It is the natural and predictable result of what the environment has done to their nervous system. And a school system that doesn't have the training and resources to recognize and respond to that will treat it as bad behavior, will discipline rather than support, will push kids out rather than hold them in. By Jeff's own trajectory, dropping out or leaving school without graduation, by most accounts, the school system did not hold him in, it lost him. And when a school loses a young man in Jeff's situation, the street is right there to provide the structure, the belonging, and the sense of purpose that the school failed to deliver. People who cover Jeff's story consistently compared him to King Von, and that comparison is worth examining with some depth because it illuminates something important about the specific cultural ecosystem Jeff was embedded in and the role that martyrdom plays in it. King Von, born Davon Bennett on August 9th, 1994, in Chicago's Parkway Gardens neighborhood, known as O Block, was killed on November 6, 2020 at 26 years old. Shot outside an Atlanta nightclub, Von had, in the years before his death, built one of the most compelling individual careers in Chicago drill history. His signature narrative style, first-person hyper-specific storytelling about violence that felt more like a film treatment than a rap song, was genuinely innovative. Songs like Crazy Story and Took Her to the O were not just popular, they established a template for how to translate street experience into musical narrative with cinematic specificity. And Von, like Jeff, was understood by his audience to be rapping about real things. The One Talk story he told in Crazy Story was understood to be drawn from real incidents. His references to O Block and its conflicts were understood to reflect real ongoing violence. The authenticity was not performed. It was the foundation of the entire artistic identity. Von's death made him a martyr in the Chicago drill community in a way that reverberated for years after. His catalog grew enormously in streams after his death. His status elevated posthumously. He became a template, a model of what a Chicago drill career could look like, of what the combination of real talent and real street credibility and real violence could produce in terms of cultural impact. And importantly, his death, tragic and premature and completely avoidable as it was, did not diminish his status in the eyes of his community and fan base. If anything, it solidified it. Jeff was directly compared to Von by people who covered his rise. The comparison was meant as a compliment, and that's the detail that should trouble you, because what the comparison implicitly communicates is this: the template for success in this space, the validated path, the model career, is one that ends in violent death at a young age, with a posthumous catalog and a martyr status. That is what the ecosystem had built as the exemplary outcome. When a young man growing up in Jeff's position looks at the examples around him, the successful careers, the respective figures, the people who made it in the world he is embedded in, and the primary examples available to him are people who combine talent with extreme violence and die young in a way that generated ongoing cultural reverence, the incentive structure for his own choices is shaped by that observation. You don't have to consciously decide to model yourself on King Von. You don't have to explicitly say, I want to live fast and die young. The modeling can be entirely unconscious, built into the ambient cultural environment as a definition of what success looks like in this specific world. This is not a critique of King Von's legacy. It is an observation about what happens at a systemic level when the most celebrated outcomes in a specific cultural ecosystem are ones that involve violence and early death. When those are the examples, the ecosystem needs to actively build counterexamples, needs to actively celebrate and support the drill artists who find ways to build sustainable careers, to grow older, to expand their artistic range beyond the most violent expression of their early work, to live. The ecosystem has been bad at building and amplifying those counterexamples, and young men like Jeff pay the cost of that failure. Jeff Harris is gone. The 19 bullets that hit him on South Rose Avenue on June 8, 2024 ended that story with brutal finality. The question is not how to save Jeff. The question is whether anything changes as a result of what happened to him. The honest answer, looking at the current state of things, is that very little has changed in the specific systems that failed Jeff. The music industry is still amplifying the most extreme drill content without adequate interrogation of what that content is documented. The streaming platforms are still monetizing music that functions as documented confession of homicide, without meaningful engagement with the ethical questions that raises. The schools in Chicago's high violence neighborhoods are still chronically under-resourced for trauma-informed instruction. The violence interruption programs are still underfunded relative to the scale of the need. The grief support infrastructure for young men in gang-involved communities who lose close family members is still essentially non-existent. What has changed is the conversation. Jeff's story has been documented, analyzed, discussed, and debated in ways that have reached audiences who were not previously engaged with the specific human cost of what the Chicago drill ecosystem produces. This documentary is part of that conversation. The Trap Lord Ross episode on Jeff is part of that conversation. The street-level discussion among people who knew him and people who came up in similar conditions is part of that conversation. Conversations change culture over time, and culture change over time changes systems. That is a slow process. It is a process measured in years and decades rather than in weeks and months. But here's where I want to leave you, because I think it matters that we don't end this in either nihilism or false hope. The psychological research on violence prevention is, in its broad findings, genuinely hopeful, not naively hopeful, not disconnected from the real conditions that produce Jeff's story, but factually, empirically hopeful. Intervention works. At multiple points along the radicalization trajectory, from the early adolescent identity rupture through the grief-driven escalation to even the active street involvement, there are documented evidence-based interventions that produce measurable reductions in violent behavior and significant improvements in life outcomes. The knowledge exists, the tools exist. What is missing is the sustained, adequately funded, culturally informed application of those tools at the scale the problem requires. Every kid on the Chicago block right now who is in the position Jeff was in at 16, who just got cut from the team, who just lost a family member, who is being pulled toward an identity built around violence because the legitimate alternatives are invisible or inaccessible, that kid's story is not written yet. The warning signs are there. They are always there. They were there with Jeff, loud and clear and impossible to miss if you knew what to look for. What this video is, what it should be if we're doing this right, is a guide for how to see the warning signs the next time they're in front of you, for real. One last thing I want to address before we close this out, because it sits at the intersection of the psychological and the ethical, and I think it is important enough to not leave on the cutting room floor. There's a specific way that the internet grieves young men like Jeff, a specific ritual that happens every time a drill artist with a violent reputation dies young. And that ritual, for all the genuine feeling behind it, has a shadow side that the drill community and the broader media ecosystem have not adequately grappled with. When Jeff died, the response from the online community was massive. The tributes poured in. His music spiked in streams. The clips of him laughing with his crew, the footage of him recording, the videos of him performing, all of it circulated alongside the documentation of his death and alongside the music that documented his alleged violence. And in that flood of content, Jeff Harris Jr. was simultaneously mourned as a brother, celebrated as a killer, and consumed as entertainment. All three things happened at the same time in the same comment sections by the same audience. And the person, the actual human being who started as a kid who just wanted to play basketball and who died at 21 with 19 bullets in him, got lost somewhere in the middle of all three. The psychological literature on parasocial relationships and media consumption describes how audiences develop genuine emotional connections to public figures that feel real but are built on curated, partial, mediated versions of the person. The Jeff that most of his online audience knew was the Bloody Reaper, the Jeffrey Dahmer of Chicago Drill, the figure from I and the other tracks. They did not know the Jeff that Lil School knew, the funny, warm, present, alive Jeff who showed up in the tribute video after his death and surprised people who had only known the character. The grief that the online community expressed was real grief, but it was grief for a character, and a person inside the character, the full human being, deserves something more than character grief. He deserved a kind of reckoning that asks, how did we build this character? Who benefited from building it? And what would it have meant to love this person enough to refuse the character and insist on the person? That question is worth sitting with. Not as an indictment of anyone who genuinely mourned Jeff, but as an honest accounting of what the ecosystem produces and what it cost the people inside it. The warning signs were there. The machinery that produced them was visible. The people it destroyed were real. What we do with that, whether we just consume it as another chapter in Chicago drill history, or whether we use it to see more clearly and act differently, that is the choice the living get to make. No story like this ends cleanly. Gang conflicts do not have credits rolling. The Bloodhound Trap City War did not end when Jeff died. The music kept releasing. The next generation of young men on 79th Street watched what happened to Jeff and made their own calculations. And the Bloodhound brand, the collective Jeff had been the face of, continued operating, continued making music, and continued gaining fans. Most of the artists from Jeff's circle were, as previously mentioned, signed to Lil Bibby's Grade A Productions label following Jeff's death. That is a significant development worth unpacking. Grade A is a credible, well-resourced Chicago label with industry infrastructure and distribution. The signing represented exactly the kind of commercial validation that Jeff had been approaching but had not yet received. And the signing happened posthumously, catalyzed at least in part by the cultural moment Jeff's death created. The story of Bloodhound Lil Jeff, the violence that built their reputation, the tragedy of his death, the viral moment of his passing, all of it generated the cultural capital that translated into a label deal for the survivors. This is one of the most disturbing dynamics in the broader ecosystem. Death can be commercially valuable, not in an explicit calculated sense. No, one planned Jeff's death as a marketing strategy, but the structural reality is that his death generated a spike in streams, a flood of content, a wave of attention that had commercial value, and that commercial value found its way into contracts for the people around him. The system rewarded the tragedy, not maliciously, mechanically. And the mechanical reward structure tells the next generation of young men watching from the sidelines a story about what produces outcomes. Q50, Bloodhound Q50, Jeff's cousin and the second in command of the Bloodhound set, emerged as the primary figure carrying the Bloodhound name forward after Jeff's death. By multiple accounts, Q50 also had basketball dreams that didn't pan out. He also jumped off the porch around the same time as Jeff. He also has an alleged and documented street reputation that follows him through his music and his social media presence. Q50 is, at the time the script was written, still alive and still active. Whether the same psychological architecture that consumed Jeff is consuming Q50, whether the same warning signs are visible in him and similarly going unaddressed, that is a live question with real stakes for a real human being. I hope someone is paying attention. The broader Chicago drill ecosystem by mid-2024 had absorbed the Bloodhound moment and moved forward. New artists, new beefs, new songs, new cycles. The machine does not stop for any individual life. It processes people and keeps going. And the young men inside it, the 16-year-olds who just got cut from teams, the 18-year-olds who just lost cousins, the 20-year-olds building identities around serial killers and posting their confessions to Spotify, they are the raw material the machine runs on. The warning signs are never hidden. They are always visible. They are always there to be seen by anyone willing to actually look at what they are looking at. Bloodhound Lil Jeff showed us that with every release, every social media post, every public action from the moment the basketball dream died to the moment the 19 bullets hit, the machine kept going, the warnings kept coming, nobody stopped. That is the real story, and it is still happening right now.